So to be clear, no weapon, no yelling, no physical contact, just her presence. Was she resisting? Not physically. He wasn't defending himself. He was defending a lie. They called me dangerous because I stood still. He said, "Women like you should just do what you're told." The room cracked, mouths dropped. They looked at me like they'd finally seen the truth. Because I asked questions, because I didn't fold, because I stood where I apparently didn't belong. He made sure I disappeared behind a label: violent, hostile, dangerous. But I wasn't the one on trial, not anymore. He was. I didn't raise her voice. I raised the truth. Have you ever been judged, abused by authority, discriminated against, or had your dignity and self-worth completely stripped away? Let me tell you my story, a story that somewhere in this world still happens far too often. Leave a comment with the number 9 so I know you're with me and ready to hear what I have to share. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss any of the intense moments ahead. If you are deaf or have trouble hearing, please turn on the subtitles. We created them especially for you because you matter. This is Radio from Hine, the #1 YouTube channel for justice and equality for everyone standing strong against racism and discrimination. Wishing you a peaceful day. The first thing I saw was his smile. Not the kind you give when you're nervous, not the polite curl of someone trying to fake respect in a courtroom. No, it was the kind of smile you wear when you think you've already won. When you think the woman standing across from you isn't strong enough, smart enough, or important enough to fight back. Officer Bryce Kelton sat at the plaintiff's table with his legs casually crossed, arms folded, and that smug little smirk painted across his face like it belonged there. He didn't look at the judge, didn't glance at the jury, just stared straight at me. I didn't flinch. The courtroom was packed, too packed. Word travels fast when a black woman gets accused of assaulting a white cop in Iron Ridge. Even faster when that woman refuses a plea deal and demands her day in court. Every seat was filled, locals press, even a few officers from Kelton's department. They lined the back row in silent unity uniforms, pressed, eyes blank, lips tight, a wall. My lawyer, Keon Marshall, stood next to me, new suit, nervous energy, and a stack of notes clutched in hands that kept sweating through the paper. He was good, not great, not yet, but he believed in justice, and for now that was enough. Case 2174. The bailiff called State of Falcon Heights versus Nyla Robert. I stood slowly, deliberately. Keon adjusted his tie like it was choking him. I could feel his eyes flicker to me, looking for reassurance. I didn't give it. I didn't need to. From the corner of my eye, I saw Judge Walter Niles enter the chamber. Older white man, deep lines in his face like the bench had carved them in. He looked like he'd seen too many cases and cared too little about most of them. But today, he looked interested, not at me, at Kelton. I'd seen that look before, the kind of attention authority gives itself when it thinks it's cleaning up a mess. Problem is, I wasn't the mess. I was the one they tried to sweep under the rug. Mrs. Robert, the judge said. His voice was steady, but there was a stiffness to it, like he'd already made up his mind. Are you aware of the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand that you're being accused of obstructing a peace officer resisting arrest and attempting to assault a law enforcement agent? I understand, I replied, calm cold. There was a pause. I could feel the air shift. One woman in the audience actually gasped when she heard assault. I didn't turn around, didn't give the gallery anything. Let them think what they wanted. They'd find out soon enough. Keon spoke up, his voice just barely holding. Your Honor, we plead not guilty on all charges and are prepared to proceed. Bryce Kelton didn't even blink. He leaned back slightly in his chair as if this was all a minor inconvenience. Like my existence, my defense was nothing more than a bump in the road of his invincibility. Judge Niles nodded and motioned for the state to begin. Officer Kelton will give opening testimony. Mr. Marshall, you'll have the opportunity to cross after. Keon nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Bryce stood up slowly, like a man rising from a throne instead of a seat. He straightened his belt, adjusted his badge like it meant something, and walked to the stand like he owned the room. I watched his every move, not because I was afraid, because I had been trained to watch. To assess, to track tension in shoulders, to recognize the shift in a man's posture when he's about to lie. And Bryce Kelton was about to lie. The jury looked at him like he was trustworthy. The uniform helped. The skin helped more. But that smirk, that smug little twitch at the edge of his mouth, that told me everything I needed to know. He thought this would be easy. He thought I'd crack. He thought I was just another angry black woman the system could chew up and forget. But he didn't know who I was. Not yet. And when the truth finally came out, that smile of his would be the first thing to go. He started with a sigh, like reliving the night was just so exhausting. Like being the victim here had taken something out of him. Officer Bryce Kelton leaned into the microphone, hands folded like he was praying, voice steady, too steady, practiced. I responded to a disturbance call on Harper Avenue, he began. Business was closed. Premises were dark. I observed a female individual later identified as the defendant standing near the side entrance. He glanced at the jury as he spoke. Not at me, never at me. She appeared agitated. When I approached and asked for identification, she immediately became defensive, aggressive. She raised her voice, refused to cooperate, and attempted to walk away. There it was. The shift. He dropped female individual and started using she like he knew me. She refused multiple verbal commands I attempted to de-escalate, but when I placed a hand on her arm to keep her from leaving, she struck me in the chest and reached for my service weapon. There was a murmur. Someone in the front row leaned forward just a little, and Kelton. He didn't even pause. I had to restrain her for public safety. For mine, I acted in accordance with my training and department protocols. He leaned back, his hands still folded, mouth now resting in a solemn line. Like all of it hurt, like this wasn't a performance. But I knew the truth. His hands only folded when there were no cameras. That night they weren't folded, they were fists. Keon shifted beside me. I saw his knee bouncing slightly. I didn't blame him. Kelton's version was airtight, simple, believable. He sounded like every official statement that ever buried the truth under uniformed authority. No emotion, just enough empathy to sound human. But not enough to give me one. The prosecutor stood and asked follow-ups. Were you afraid for your safety? Officer Kelton. Yes, Bryce answered. Anytime a suspect reaches near your firearm, you're trained to respond. And this was a high-risk encounter. Absolutely. She was non-compliant, physically aggressive. It escalated quickly. There it was again. That word escalated. It always comes up when they talk about us. Never how it starts, always how we respond. The prosecutor turned to the judge. No further questions. Judge Niles nodded, then glanced at Keon Defense May Cross. Keon stood slowly, fingers twitching slightly on his tie. He walked to the center of the room and stared at Kelton for a beat too long. Trying to find a crack, Officer Kelton. He began, you said the defendant was aggressive from the beginning. Yes. She didn't push you first. She didn't threaten you. She simply refused to provide ID. She raised her voice. Her tone was hostile. Hostile tone. Got it. Keon nodded slowly, and when she asked why you needed her ID, did you answer, I don't recall. But you do recall her striking you and reaching for your weapon, yes? Just to be clear, Keon said, turning slightly toward the jury, you remember the exact pressure of her palm hitting your chest, but not the question she asked you before that. Kelton stiffened. She wasn't cooperative. Keon didn't flinch. Do you know how many people are falsely arrested every year for being uncooperative? Objection, the prosecutor snapped. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said flatly. Keon exhaled sharply. No further questions. He walked back to the table, jaw tight. We both knew what had just happened. Bryce Kelton had laid his foundation, and it was strong. On the surface, I sat back, eyes forward. They thought they had a story. A neat, polished, rehearsed little script. But I hadn't said a word yet. And they didn't know that I never enter a battlefield without knowing how to win it. They say the courtroom is neutral ground. But when you're a black woman sitting at the defense table accused of assaulting a white cop, it doesn't feel neutral. It feels like walking into a room that's already made its decision, and you're just there to hear the sentence. The walls were too quiet, the kind of quiet that stretches between people when they want to believe something ugly, and already do. The jury wasn't overtly hostile, but I recognized the look. Tight lips, crossed arms, eyes that only relaxed when they glanced at Kelton. One woman kept staring at my hands like she expected them to twitch or curl into fists, like she was waiting for me to prove him right. I didn't move. Keon whispered beside me, voice low. We're holding, but barely. I nodded. Keep your hands steady. The real game hasn't started yet. He blinked at me. He wasn't used to calm like this. Not in someone wearing cuffs 2 days ago, not in someone being called a criminal on the local news. But I'd sat in briefing rooms before dawn listening to mission updates while insurgents circled 2 miles out. This wasn't new, this was just politics with robes. Judge Niles cleared his throat and looked directly at me. Ms. Robert, you'll be called to testify after recess. Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. I stood hands unclasped, head high. Kelton didn't even glance my way this time. He didn't need to. He thought his testimony had landed like a hammer. In his mind, the nail was already buried. Outside in the hallway, the whispers followed us. She looked so composed. That's the one, huh? The SEAL woman. I heard she snapped and tried to take his gun. Every sentence sounded like it came from behind a shield safe detached. No one talked to me directly. They just circled like spectators at a slow-burning house fire. Keon and I sat on a bench away from the noise. He stared at his notepad like it held answers. He hadn't learned how to read yet. You nervous? I asked. He looked up, terrified. I let that hang for a second. Good. He half laughed. Nervous people prepare better than cocky ones. You'll be fine. He studied me. You're not nervous. No. Because you've done this before. I turned to him. No, because I've survived worse. He didn't ask what I meant, maybe because he already knew, or maybe because he was scared of the answer. The bailiff reappeared. We're back on. As we re-entered, the weight of the room returned, but heavier this time. Every eye followed me back to my seat. I wasn't in uniform, but I felt like I was marching again. Each step measured, controlled. Not for intimidation, for survival. The defense table felt colder than before, like it knew what was coming. Judge Niles tapped his gavel. Ms. Robert, please take the stand. I rose, walked forward, sat. The oath was read, but I didn't need it. I'd sworn to protect truth long before this day. Keon approached slowly. Ms. Robert, he began. You've heard the testimony provided by Officer Kelton. Before we dive into the specifics, I'd like to ask, were you doing anything illegal the night of your arrest? No. Were you armed? No. Were you being aggressive? I looked straight at him. No. He nodded. Tell us what happened in your own words. The room leaned in. Even the judge sat forward an inch. I cleared my throat once, then started. I was walking home. I'd visited a friend earlier that evening. I stopped near a closed bookstore to check directions on my phone. That's when a flashlight hit me in the face. A pause, I let it settle. I asked what the problem was. He asked for ID. I asked, why? Keon raised an eyebrow. And his response. He didn't like being questioned. His tone shifted. He said, I was being uncooperative. What did you do? I tried to explain. Told him I wasn't trespassing, just standing on a sidewalk. And then he grabbed my arm. Gasps, small ones. Judge Niles didn't gavel, not yet. And did you resist? I met Keon's gaze. No, I told him not to touch me. I said he had no right. And his reply, my voice didn't waver. He said, and I quote, women like you should just do what you're told. The room cracked. Whispers rose, mouths dropped. And that was the moment. I knew I'd finally punctured the silence. The air shifted. Not like a breeze, more like a pressure drop. The kind that makes your ears ring before a storm. My words were still hanging in the air like smoke. Women, like you should just do what you're told. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't cried, but the tremor it left behind was louder than any shout. Even Judge Niles blinked. The court reporter hesitated before typing again. And for the first time, the jury didn't look at me like a defendant. They looked at me like they'd seen something they couldn't quite name. "Please continue," Keon said softly, his voice steadier now. I nodded, letting the moment breathe before I kept going. I pulled my arm back and asked him not to touch me. I was clear calm. He didn't care. He tightened his grip and said, "I was resisting." Keon took a slow step forward. "Were you?" "No, I wasn't even moving. I stood still. I didn't push, swing, yell, nothing." But once he said the word resisting, it was like he gave himself permission. Permission to do what? My jaw locked for a second before I spoke. "To hurt me." A hush fell again. He twisted my wrist behind my back, shoved me toward his patrol car, slammed me into the hood, then he cuffed me. Keon inhaled deeply. "Did you say anything during that?" I said he was hurting me. I asked why he was arresting me. He didn't answer. "And at any point did you reach for his weapon?" I looked directly at Bryce Kelton, still sitting stone-faced across the courtroom. "No, I never touched his weapon. I never got close to it. That was his invention." The prosecutor shifted in his seat, clearly itching to object, but he didn't. "Not yet." Keon nodded. "Why do you think he made that claim?" I could have said 1,000 things, but I didn't need 1,000. I only needed one. Because it's the easiest lie to tell when a black woman refuses to be silent. There it was. The truth laid bare. And from the way the room held its breath, I knew they felt it too. Keon took a second before continuing. "Did you threaten Officer Kelton?" "No." "Did you act violently in any way?" "No." "Then let me ask you this. Why do you think you were arrested that night?" I sat up straighter, let my voice go firm, not sharp, just unshakable. Because I asked questions, because I didn't fold, because I stood on a sidewalk where I apparently didn't belong. I paused. Not because I forgot anything, because I wanted them to sit with it. They didn't see a woman trying to get home. They saw a problem to neutralize. And when I wouldn't shrink, he made sure I was forced to disappear behind a label. Violent, hostile, dangerous. Keon glanced at the jury. "And what label do you think you were hoping they'd believe today?" "Victim." I saw 2 jurors shift in their seats. One finally met my eyes and didn't look away. Keon stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Niles turned to the prosecutor Cross. The prosecutor stood slowly adjusting his tie, like it was suddenly too tight, "Ms. Robert. You say you were calm, collected. But earlier, you admitted you pulled your arm away from a law enforcement officer. That's not passive." "I pulled away because I was being grabbed against my will." "Yet you chose not to comply, isn't that correct?" "I chose not to surrender my rights. That's different." He narrowed his eyes. "Were you taught that during your military training?" I tilted my head slightly, not enough to smirk, just enough to let him know he had no idea what he was walking into. "I was taught to assess threats, de-escalate conflict, defend when necessary." That night, I used every ounce of that training to avoid doing exactly what he accused me of. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you restrained yourself." "No, I'm saying I saved him from what he wanted me to become." He froze for a moment, then muttered, "No further questions." As I stepped down from the stand, I didn't look at Kelton. I didn't need to. The damage was done. His story had been clean, precise, polished. But mine had splinters, blood, silence, and fire. And now for the first time, it had an audience. I sat back down. The wooden chair beneath me creaked, or maybe it was just the pressure shifting again. The room wasn't sure what to believe anymore, and that was new. Bryce Kelton's eyes finally flicked toward me, just a glance, but I saw it. The calculation, the realization, the fear. He'd never thought I'd get this far. He didn't think a woman like me with this skin, this voice, this refusal to apologize could make it through the courtroom without breaking. He expected defiance. He got discipline. He expected rage. He got truth. And now he was slipping. Judge Niles called for a short recess. The jurors filed out their faces tighter than before, eyes no longer blank. They weren't just listening now, they were comparing. Kelton's narrative had the polish of procedure. Mine had scars, and scars talk louder than paperwork. I I turned to Keon as soon as the room cleared. He didn't say a word at first, just handed me a bottle of water, his hand still trembling slightly. "You did good," he said. I nodded. "Now let's make it undeniable." His lips parted. "You're sure?" "Yes. Even if they try to suppress it?" I met his eyes. They can't suppress what's already burned into memory. When the courtroom reconvened, the energy had changed. Tension always leaves a fingerprint. The walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower, the silence heavier. Judge Niles tapped his gavel. "Mr. Marshall, does the defense wish to proceed?" Keon stood this time without the usual hesitation. His tie was still crooked, but his spine was straight. "Yes, Your Honor." The defense would like to submit video evidence that directly contradicts Officer Kelton's account. The prosecutor shot up. "Objection. This footage was not submitted during discovery. It's inadmissible." Judge Niles raised a hand. "Mr. Marshall." Keon stepped forward. "The footage was obtained from a private citizen who only came forward 2 nights ago. It was verified and time-stamped. We've submitted a digital copy to the court clerk and are prepared to play the footage now." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." The bailiff crossed the room and inserted the USB into the system. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't need to watch it again. I already knew what it showed, but I needed them to see it. The screen flickered to life. The angle was shaky, filmed from a parked car across the street. A windshield wiper crossed the shot once or twice. But the audio was crystal clear. Bryce's voice sharp and unmistakable. "Stop talking and face the car." My voice. "I'm not resisting. I'm just asking why you're touching me." And then a thud, metal on bone, the sound of me being slammed into the hood of the car. "You don't get to question me," Kelton growled. "You people never learn." A collective inhale swept the courtroom. Even the gallery packed with uniforms and crossed arms couldn't hide it this time. The screen went black. The judge didn't gavel, didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence was its own verdict. Keon's voice was quiet, but strong. That was the night in question, captured by a witness parked on Harper Avenue. Officer Kelton claimed the defendant was aggressive. What that video shows is force without provocation, words with bias, and an arrest based not on threat but on control. The prosecutor looked stunned, not because he hadn't expected a fight, but because for the first time the fight had teeth. "Objection," he finally stammered. "This is inflammatory." "It's evidence," Keon said, "and it speaks for itself." The judge leaned forward, his face unreadable. "Motion to strike is denied. The video will remain on record." I exhaled, for the first time in what felt like days. Bryce Kelton sat frozen. His jaw was locked, his hands balled into fists on the table. He didn't look at me, not now. Because everything about him, his case, his confidence, his armor, had a crack. And it started with forgetting about that video. Or maybe thinking no one would care enough to film a black woman being hurt. Outside, the wind howled down Main Street. I heard it through the courtroom glass, but inside, it was still. Like the whole building was holding its breath. I turned to Keon. "This is the first fracture," I said quietly. He blinked. "You think he'll crack?" I looked back at Kelton, at the way he stared at nothing. "No," I said, "I think he already has." We didn't speak until we were back in the car. Keon drove in silence, knuckles tight on the wheel. The tension was still crawling up his neck like he hadn't taken a full breath since the video played, neither had I. Even with the courtroom emptied, even with that footage now etched into the court record, I could still feel the weight of it. Not just the moment on camera, but what came after. The humiliation. The steel of the cuffs against my wrists. The way the officers joked outside the holding cell, loud enough for me to hear, pretending I didn't understand their code words. They didn't see me as someone who served. They saw a threat they didn't need to justify neutralizing. I watched the city lights flicker past the window. The grocery store where I used to buy peanut butter. The corner where kids still sold lemonade in summer, all of it still looked the same. But something in me had shifted. Keon finally broke the silence. "We could have started with it," he said quietly. "That footage, that one move might have saved us hours of doubt. Why did you wait, Nyla?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched his face reflected in the windshield. Young, sharp, smart, but still learning what kind of fight this really was. Because if we started with that, I said, they would have only seen me as the victim. Isn't that what you are? No, I shook my head. I'm the survivor, and that difference matters. He glanced at me confused. I leaned back in the passenger seat, arms folded across my chest. They needed to hear my voice first. My truth, not just some shaky recording. They needed to hear me tell them exactly what he did, what it meant, how it felt. If I gave them the video first, they'd say it colored my story, that I was using shock value. But I wanted them to see that I never needed that footage to prove who I am. He blinked, but it still helped. Of course it helped. I said, truth always helps. But the point is, it was never supposed to carry my story, I carry it. He pulled over near my building and killed the engine. We sat there for a minute, headlights bouncing off the sidewalk. Then he asked the real question. The one he'd been circling all day. Why didn't you tell me I turned to face him? He didn't mean the video. He meant me. All of me. I took a breath, slow and deliberate. Because people like you believe in the system. I said, you think if you work hard enough, present enough evidence, argue well enough, justice will happen. But people like me, we've lived long enough to know that truth alone isn't always enough. He didn't interrupt. He didn't blink. He just listened. I didn't tell you I was a Navy SEAL because I didn't want you to lean on it. I didn't want that to be what made me believable. I wanted my words to stand first, and if they couldn't, then fine. Let the uniform speak second. He nodded slowly like it hurt to agree with me, and maybe it did. He leaned back in his seat, hands on the steering wheel again. So what now? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder, worn edges, creased spine. I held it out to him. He hesitated, then took it. What is it? My service record. His eyes widened. You're giving this to me, I nodded. You're my lawyer, I said. You need to know who you're defending, not just what I went through, but who I am. He opened it, slowly flipping through the pages. Photos, deployment lists, commendations. A copy of my DD-214. A letter of recommendation from a rear admiral. Jesus, he muttered, Lieutenant Commander. I looked out the window again, retired but still breathing. He kept flipping. His hands were steadier now. And his eyes, something had changed there. He wasn't just seeing a case anymore. He was seeing a weapon, one the court hadn't expected. He looked up. Are you ready to use this? I turned to him. I've been ready for a long time, I said. Back in my apartment, I stood alone. The lights were dim. The silence was deeper than I remembered. I walked to the mantel above the fireplace, picked up the folded American flag that had sat there for years, unmoved, untouched. Until now. I held it in my hands, felt the weight of it. The contradiction. A country I fought for. And one that tried to erase me the second I stopped being convenient. Outside the window, I could see a flicker of red and blue lights reflecting off the street. They weren't here for me, but they had been. And they could be again. I placed the flag back on the mantel and stepped away. Tomorrow, they'd learn more than just the charges. They'd learn who I was before the arrest. And why a man like Bryce Kelton should have never assumed I was the one on trial. Before I was ever put in cuffs, I wore something heavier, a flak vest, a SEAL trident. Responsibility. And before they ever called me defendant, I was called commander. The night before I testified again, I didn't sleep, not because of fear, because of memory. It started like it always does with the desert. Afghanistan. Dust, thick as regret, sweat burning your eyes before the sun even rises. You learn to stop blinking. You learn to move through it anyway. I was leading my team through a hostile valley, 2 clicks out from extraction. Intel said the route was clear. Intel was wrong. First shot cracked through a radio. Second took out our comms. We were blind. Cut off. My men dropped into formation instantly. No hesitation, no screaming. Just the discipline of people who'd walked into hell before and knew how to get out. I remember every breath I took that day, every decision I made, the way I radioed for backup even knowing no one could hear. I positioned our sniper flanked hard left, covered our medic as he pulled a wounded brother behind the ridge. Ordered air support with a flare I wasn't sure would even be seen, calculated, controlled exact. It wasn't rage that saved us. It was control. We made it out. No medals were given for that mission, no headlines, no parades. But we walked out alive. And in my world, that's a win. That's the job. So when I stood in that courtroom, it wasn't just me up there. It was every decision I ever made under fire, every moment I'd chosen not to pull the trigger. Every time I saw fear in someone else's eyes and knew my job was to make them feel safe again, Bryce Kelton did the opposite. He wore a badge and a weapon and used both to escalate, not protect. He wasn't trained for restraint. He was trained for power. And he liked it. He used fear the way we were trained to resist it. I was trained for precision, for clarity, to walk into chaos and bring order, not impose it. To lead, not dominate. To defend, not control. That's what made us different. Keon sat across from me at my kitchen table that night. He was still holding my service record like it was radioactive, as if the pages might burn holes through his hands. He didn't ask more questions about it, didn't need to. He'd read enough. Instead, he said something simple. You know, this changes the trial. I nodded, I know. You sure you want to use it? Not for pity, I said, but for proof. He nodded again. So when? Soon, I said, not yet. He raised the brow. You're playing this like a tactician, I smirked. I am one. The next morning, I walked into court different. Not louder, not bolder, but sharper. Like every part of me had returned from that desert and sat inside the woman now wearing a navy blue blazer and braided hair pulled back tight. Posture locked, eyes forward, not defensive, ready. People still stared, but it was different now. Not just curiosity, something closer to respect. Or maybe fear because people fear what they can't reduce. And uncertainty works in my favor. Keon leaned over and whispered, "You look like you own the room." I don't need to own it, I said. I just need them to remember I've survived worse. Judge Niles called us to order. The gavel hit wood. Bryce Kelton didn't look up. For once, that smirk wasn't there, just the ghost of it tugging at a mouth, now twitching with unease. Keon stood papers in hand, but voice steady. Your Honor, the defense will not be calling a new witness today, but we do have more questions for the court to consider. He glanced at me, then back at the bench. Specifically, questions about Officer Kelton's training, his history, and his credibility. The prosecutor tensed. The judge gave a slow nod. Proceed. I didn't blink, because I knew what was coming next. We were done waiting. The war was here. And this time, I wasn't leading soldiers, I was leading truth. I fought for this flag. He hides behind it. They say a badge comes with weight. But the truth is, some badges are lighter than others, especially when they're protected by silence. After court adjourned that day, Keon didn't go straight home. He went digging. He'd tasted the crack in Kelton's testimony and knew there had to be more. And once a lawyer with something to prove gets a scent, the smart thing to do is get out of the way. I spent the evening cleaning my gun, not because I needed to. Because it centers me, strip it clean, it reassemble it. The weight of steel in your hands reminds you that tools are only as dangerous as the people behind them. Kelton had a badge. I had a weapon. One of us trained to use it with restraint. The other used it with permission. When Keon called me the next morning, his voice was different. No hesitation, no confusion, just fury, cold and clear. You need to come to my office, now. The walls of his office were lined with case files and legal pads, but today they were covered with something else, complaint forms, disciplinary records, internal memos with entire paragraphs blacked out. Kelton's file, not the sanitized version they show the public, the real one. Keon didn't say anything right away. He just handed me a printed copy and let me read for myself. There were 5 complaints filed against Officer Bryce Kelton over the last 6 years. 5. 3 for excessive force, 2 for racial bias. one involving a teenage boy who suffered a broken wrist during a stop and frisk. All 5 were either dismissed for lack of evidence or resolved internally. No charges, no suspensions, no official reprimand. Just whispers buried in paperwork. One complaint had been redacted so heavily, the only readable phrase was, "Officer acted within departmental guidelines." Keon pointed to it. "That one came from a nurse," woman said. "Kelton shoved her when she tried to intervene during an arrest. The suspect had already been restrained." I kept flipping. There was even a body cam malfunction listed in a prior incident 2 years ago. Same story, same excuse, same silence. How is he still a cop? I asked, already knowing the answer. Keon didn't flinch. Because his record looks clean on the surface. Because no one pushed hard enough. Because some supervisors protect their favorites. I looked up, or their liabilities. He nodded slowly. Exactly. He stepped back, arms crossed, watching me. "We can submit this. Enter it into evidence. Show the jury this isn't a one-off. This is a pattern. A protected pattern." I looked at the files again, at the names that were buried, ignored. Women, young men, black, mostly. Every complaint was a warning flare someone had shot into the sky, but no one had looked up. In court later that day, Keon was a different man, controlled yes, but now armed. When the judge gave him the floor, he didn't waste a second. "Your Honor, the defense moves to enter Officer Kelton's disciplinary history into evidence. 5 separate complaints, none pursued, 2 with footage that mysteriously disappeared, 1 with a corroborating witness ignored." The prosecutor shot up, already shouting, "Your Honor, we object. This is prejudicial, irrelevant to the incident in question." Judge Niles held up a hand. "Sit down." That one sentence carried more weight than anything else that morning. The courtroom fell quiet as the judge reviewed the documents. His face didn't change, but his silence did. When he finally spoke, it was deliberate. "This court finds the officer's record to be directly relevant to the matter of credibility. The motion is granted." The words hit like a controlled detonation. Kelton didn't look up, didn't shift, didn't blink. But I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just his story that was unraveling now, it was his shield. When we left the courtroom, people didn't whisper anymore. They stared, not at me, at him. And for once, he was the one shrinking beneath the weight of 100 eyes. He wasn't just a liar, he was protected. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's surveillance, sometimes it's survival, and sometimes it's strategy. I'd let them talk, let Bryce paint me as a threat, let the courtroom soak in his lies. Because silence, when timed right, doesn't make you invisible, it makes you unforgettable. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror running my hands over my blazer, checking the seams like I was inspecting body armor. Not because I was nervous, but because I was preparing for combat. Not the kind with bullets and IEDs, the kind where perception wounds deeper than shrapnel. Keon knocked gently on the door of my waiting room inside the courthouse. His eyes were serious, but calmer now. Ever since the files on Kelton had been admitted into evidence, he carried himself like a man who finally believed we might win. "You ready?" he asked. I turned from the mirror, picked up a small folder off the table, and tapped it once against my palm. "They think they know who I am," I said. "They only know what I haven't told them yet." He looked at the folder. "We revealing it today?" I shook my head. "Not yet." His brows furrowed. "Why not now?" "We've got their attention." The momentum. I walked toward the door, heels deliberate against the tile. Because sometimes you don't fire until the target's within inches, not when they're still out of range. In court, the jury sat stiff and still, like they were bracing for something. They had seen the cracks, the lies. Now they were waiting for the whole damn wall to collapse. But I wasn't ready to give them the hammer, not yet. Judge Niles called the court to order. The prosecutor barely made eye contact. Bryce Kelton sat with both hands flat on the table now. No more folded arms, no more smirk. He looked like a man trying to remember the last moment he felt safe. Keon stood, "Your Honor." The defense would like to reserve its witness disclosure for later in the proceedings. We are still evaluating timing. The prosecutor opened his mouth. Judge Niles beat him to it. Granted. That alone told me everything. Even the judge was watching more carefully now. During recess, Keon pulled me aside. They're waiting for you to drop it. The background, the career, the SEAL stuff. I know, I said, and the longer I hold it, the heavier it gets. He looked nervous. We can't wait too long. I faced him. Keon, you ever seen an EOD tech handle a live bomb? He blinked. No. They don't scream, don't rush. They breathe. They listen. And they wait, because the difference between rushing and surviving is millimeters. I leaned in, voice low. This trial is a bomb, and every word we say is a wire. The courtroom buzzed with press that day. More cameras, more eyes. People weren't just curious anymore. They were choosing sides. I felt it in the hallway, the way two court officers avoided eye contact. The way a woman in the gallery mouthed thank you when I walked past. The tide was shifting. But tides don't break walls. Pressure does. And I was still building mine. At the defense table, Keon passed me a note. One more day, I nodded. The prosecutor called his next witness, tried to redirect focus. But the room didn't lean in the same way anymore. The jury's attention stayed on me even when I said nothing. That's the thing about silence. Once it gets loud enough, it starts sounding like prophecy. Back at my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The flag on the mantel was still folded, still waiting. The folder with my full military credentials lay beside me. I hadn't opened it, didn't need to. I already knew what it said. The question was, when would I let them read it? My silence was never weakness, it was timing. They thought they had seen all of me. The woman in the blazer. The defendant. The one who spoke softly carried herself like someone with nothing left to lose but dignity. But what they didn't understand was, I never came to court with nothing. I came with restraint. And now I was done holding it. The courtroom was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Word had spread. Something was coming. They didn't know what, but they could feel it. That's the thing about tension. When it gets heavy enough, people show up just to watch it snap. Keon looked at me across the defense table. He didn't need to ask again. I nodded once. Today was the day. But before I rose, I let myself breathe. Just once, deep and full. The way I used to before breach ops. This room had tried to shrink me. Today, I wasn't here to fit inside it. I was here to dismantle it brick by brick. Judge Niles entered. The gavel hit the wood, but it sounded different this time. Less control, more anticipation. Mr. Marshall, the judge began, is the defense prepared to proceed? Keon stood, no notes in hand, no legal pad, just the weight of what he was about to drop. We'd rehearsed this moment without writing it down. Not because we didn't prepare, but because truth lives better when spoken from the gut. Yes, Your Honor, he said clearly. The defense would like to recall Ms. Nyla Robert to the stand. Whispers rose instantly. I rose from my seat, shoulders, square steps even, not rushed, not hesitant. Just like I'd trained, just like I used to walk into briefings in hostile zones, head high, spine steel. Once seated, Keon approached. He didn't start with a long introduction, just 4 words. Tell them who you are. I looked at the jury, at the prosecutor, at Bryce Kelton, whose hands now gripped the edge of the table so tight his knuckles had gone pale. And I spoke. My name is Lieutenant Commander Nyla Robert, United States Navy, retired. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was explosive. The room froze. Even the court reporter paused mid-keystroke. Bryce's jaw slackened. His eyes went wide like someone had just yanked the earth out from under his feet. I let the silence linger. Then I continued. For over 20 years, I served in naval special warfare, multiple deployments, joint task force operations, counter-terrorism work in regions I'm not even allowed to name. I led teams, saved lives, and carried caskets draped in flags. I turned slightly toward the jury. I was trained to neutralize real threats, to distinguish fear from fact, to make judgment calls with lives hanging in the balance. Keon's voice was steady, and the night you were arrested. There was no threat, I said. There was only power, misused, projected, because I didn't bow, because I didn't make myself smaller. The prosecutor rose, flustered. Objection relevance. Overruled, Judge Niles said instantly. His tone had changed. This wasn't just testimony now. It was revelation. Keon stepped closer. Why didn't you reveal this earlier? I held the folder in my lap, tapped it once. Because I wanted them to see me as a person first, not a title, not a resume. A woman who stood on a sidewalk and asked a question. I turned again to the jury. I didn't want to win this case because I wore a uniform. I wanted to win it because I deserved to. Another murmur swept the room. And for once, it wasn't doubt, it was recognition. Kelton was visibly sweating now. He shifted in his seat like the floor was starting to burn. Keon gave me the nod. It was time to finish it. Lieutenant Commander Robert, he said, voice clear in your expert opinion as a highly trained tactical officer, did your behavior that night pose any threat to Officer Kelton's safety? I stared directly at Kelton when I answered. No, I said, and he knew that. After I stepped down, the room didn't return to normal. It couldn't. A juror dabbed her cheek. The court reporter kept glancing toward the judge. Even the bailiff looked like he'd forgotten how to stand still. Even Judge Niles. He just sat there for a long moment, like the weight of what had been said still hung in the air, dripping from the ceiling like oil. Because something had shifted, not just in the jury, in everyone. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had tripled. Reporters, protesters, strangers, just standing there in the cold trying to get a glimpse of what justice might finally look like. I didn't speak to the cameras, didn't wave. I walked past them all, but not unnoticed. Because that was the moment the world stopped seeing me as angry and started seeing me as real. And for once, they stopped seeing me as angry. They started seeing me as real. There's always a pushback. The moment you speak truth loud enough, someone tries to shut the door on your voice. But this door was already off its hinges. The air in the courtroom was heavy the next morning, not from heat, but from memory. People remembered what I said, what I wore, how I stood. And more importantly, how Kelton didn't. He walked in wearing the same pressed uniform, same badge on his chest, but it didn't look like armor anymore. It looked like costume, the kind a child wears when he still believes it makes him powerful. His shoulders sagged slightly. His eyes scanned the room, not for threats, but for exits. A man used to power, now unsure what to do without it. The courtroom didn't buzz like it used to. There was no ambient murmur. Just silence and the occasional cough, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the moment. Someone popped the balloon. The prosecution called him back to the stand. He walked slower this time. No swagger, just that tight tension in his neck like he was trying to hold his face together. The bailiff called him forward, and even that sounded quieter than usual. When he sat, the silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Officer Kelton, you've heard the defendant's statements, her military record, her training. Do you have anything you'd like to say in response? Kelton nodded once. His voice was scratchy. Yes, her background is impressive. I didn't know about it at the time. He paused, looking down. He didn't lift his eyes again. But that night on the street, she made sudden movements. I interpreted them as aggressive. I reacted to protect myself. There it was, the fallback strategy. When the lie doesn't hold, lean into the fear. He was trying to reframe the story without admitting guilt. Trying to twist instinct into justification. Trying to sound reasoned when really he was retreating layer by layer behind that old familiar shield. I was scared. The prosecutor jumped in. You're saying your decision was based on what you perceived as a threat. Kelton nodded. Correct. It wasn't about race or gender. It was about behavior. That word behavior landed like a slur in my chest. I stared straight ahead, hands folded tight in my lap. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't unique. This was the playbook. They teach it without writing it down, how to sound calm while blaming the body in front of you for making you uncomfortable. How to hide power behind perception. How to say, I feared for my safety, and let that be the end of the story. Keon stood for the cross. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pace, didn't dramatize it. He just stepped up and asked, so you felt threatened? Kelton nodded again, yes. Keon's tone stayed level, and this threat didn't involve a weapon, no. Did it involve any physical attack? Kelton hesitated. Not before the arrest. Did she touch you? No. Did she yell no? Keon tilted his head. So to be clear, no weapon, no contact, no raised voice, just her presence. Kelton didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the jury, but they weren't with him anymore. The silence that followed was sharper than anything Keon could have said. A ripple went through the room, not outrage, not gasps, realization. That cold, creeping awareness when an entire room starts to understand they've been sold a story, and now the truth is standing there, making them look at it. Keon kept going. Officer Kelton, in your official report, you stated the defendant reached for your holster. You stated she was physically combative. Kelton swallowed. That's what I believed I saw. Keon took one step closer. But the video we all watched, your own words said, stop talking and face the car. Her reply was, I'm not resisting. Another pause, and then Keon delivered it low, direct final. Was she resisting? Kelton's voice dropped, not physically. Not at all, Keon corrected, except in the way that made you uncomfortable, except in the way that made you reach for control. I watched Kelton fold inward inch by inch. This wasn't a man being grilled. This was a man unraveling. And somehow, everyone in that room could feel it. The judge didn't bang the gavel, didn't need to. The silence did all the work. Keon turned to the jury, his voice a final cut. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was defending a lie. And the silence that followed, it didn't belong to me. It belonged to the truth. The thing about lies is they don't like being alone. Expose one and others start crawling out with it. That morning, Keon walked into the courthouse with a different kind of fire in his eyes, not rage strategy. He carried a slim manila folder tucked under one arm, nothing flashy, but you could feel the weight in it. And for the first time, it wasn't just our side sitting straighter. Even the gallery leaned forward as if instinctively bracing for impact. Because Bryce Kelton's lie. It was never just his. Keon stood as soon as the judge called session to order calm, collected, precise. Your Honor. He began, the defense respectfully requests to introduce supplemental evidence regarding Officer Kelton's previous conduct, specifically a pattern of behavior consistent with the incident involving my client. The prosecutor was on his feet instantly. Objection, irrelevant, inflammatory, prejudicial. Overruled, Judge Niles said before Keon even opened the folder, proceed. And just like that, the court braced itself. Keon held up a document. This, he said, is a formal complaint filed by a Ms. Leona Davis 3 years ago. He passed copies to the court clerk, to the jury. I watched as papers moved down the bench like dominoes, each one about to hit someone square in the conscience. Mrs. Davis, Keon continued, was pulled over for a busted taillight. According to her sworn statement, Officer Kelton asked her to step out of the vehicle. When she asked why, he said, "Don't question me, step out or get dragged." There was a flicker across Kelton's face, a twitch, but he kept his eyes forward. Mrs. Davis complied. She put her hands on the hood, and still he slammed her down and cuffed her. The prosecutor stood again, voice strained. There was no corroborating evidence. Keon raised a second page. Actually, there was. A store camera across the street caught the incident. But that footage was mysteriously deleted from the department's records less than 48 hours after it was uploaded. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Keon turned to the jury. This isn't one isolated incident. This is a pattern of control. Suppression, violence, disguised as protocol. He laid another paper down. And Miss Davis wasn't the only one. He read off 2 more names, one male, one female, both black, both arrested under similarly vague charges, disturbing the peace, non-compliant, suspicious behavior. One of them had filed a complaint with Internal Affairs. The other hadn't even bothered. Because who believes you, Keon said when the system was built to ignore you. For the first time since this trial began, Kelton shifted. His left hand fidgeted against his leg. His right tapped the edge of the table. A rhythm, a crack in control. Keon turned to the judge. Your Honor. The defense asserts that these prior incidents demonstrate a clear behavioral pattern, a misuse of force under the guise of authority, often when challenged by individuals perceived as difficult. And now that pattern continues with my client, a Navy veteran, wrongfully profiled, arrested, and slandered. He didn't shout, didn't need to. The words hit harder because they were cold, surgical. I looked toward the jury. They weren't stone-faced anymore. One woman stared down at the printed complaint like it had punched her in the gut. A man in the back row folded his arms tighter, like he was holding something back. And Kelton, he didn't even pretend to smirk anymore. He just looked cornered. Because justice doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it shows up with paperwork and doesn't knock. Justice knocked once. This time, it kicked the door down. You don't plan for the moment when everything goes quiet. You just feel it. And when Keon finished laying out those complaints, when the jury held paper proof of what I had known in my bones, from the beginning the courtroom didn't breathe. Because this wasn't a defense anymore. It was an unveiling. We knew what was coming next. Final statements. The last thing they'd hear before retreating behind those doors to decide what version of the truth they wanted to live with. The prosecutor stood first, straight-backed, shoulders set, like he still believed he could patch the damage. He paced slowly in front of the jury, tone suddenly softer. "Ladies and gentlemen, the law isn't always perfect," he said, "but it tries." He gestured toward Kelton, who now looked more like a broken fence than a wall of justice. "Officer Kelton, like any human being, may have made mistakes, but his intent was to protect the public. He responded based on what he perceived. You've heard that word a lot. Perception. He paused for effect, and that perception may have been flawed, but that doesn't make him a criminal. It makes him human." There it was again. The quiet burial of accountability. Under words like flawed and misjudgment, as if breaking someone's dignity was just another clerical error. The prosecutor continued, "Don't let sympathy overshadow justice. What matters is what happened that night, not military records, not past complaints, not emotional testimony." He turned to the jury, eyes narrowing. What matters is whether the defendant refused to comply, whether she escalated, whether Officer Kelton had reason to act. He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you." Then he sat. But even his own voice seemed to echo into a space that no longer belonged to him. Then Keon stood. He didn't adjust his tie, didn't move to the center of the room. He just walked up, looked every juror in the eye and began, "What matters," he said quietly, "isn't just what happened that night. It's who got to define it." He paused. "For weeks, you've listened to statements, watched footage, read records. You've been asked to believe that a decorated Navy SEAL who posed no physical threat, who complied without violence, who stood on a sidewalk and asked a question, was dangerous enough to be cuffed and slammed against a car. He let that sit. You were asked to accept that the officer's fear was enough." Another pause. Fear is powerful, but fear isn't always the same as danger. Sometimes it's a story we tell to justify what we've already done. He walked slowly toward the jury box. "And let's be honest, if my client didn't have the title, the training, the documentation, if she was just a woman without a record to fall back on, would you still be here listening this closely?" He turned back toward me. I didn't move, didn't blink, because I knew what was coming. He motioned toward me. "Nyla, Robert didn't ask for this fight. She didn't provoke it. She didn't weaponize her voice or her presence." He faced the jury again. She stood her ground, and for that she was punished. The gallery was silent now. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom or indifference. This was a different silence, the kind that meant people had stopped defending their thoughts and started questioning them. Keon walked to the center, turned slowly to face every angle of the room. "Don't see her as a veteran. Don't see her as a defendant. See her as what he tried to erase." He paused for one last breath. She didn't ask to fight, but she never backed down. And with that, he stepped back, sat down beside me. No gavel. No sound, just the full gravity of a final truth dropped squarely in the middle of the courtroom. I didn't look at Kelton, didn't need to. I knew what he felt. I'd seen that look before from men who realized too late that the power they held didn't make them invincible. I didn't ask to fight, but I never backed down. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It's the quiet after the storm when everything stops moving, but you don't dare exhale because you're still waiting to see what's left standing. The jury was dismissed at 11:06 a.m. 12 people, 12 minds. I couldn't read 12 lives that now held mine in their hands. They filed out slowly, some carrying legal pads, others clutching only the weight of what they'd heard. One woman glanced at me on the way out, her expression unreadable. I've seen that look before on new recruits who hadn't yet decided if they respected you or feared you. Keon slumped into his chair the second the door closed behind them. His fingers tapped nervously on the wooden table, a twitch he couldn't shake. That went as well as it could have, he muttered more to himself than to me. I didn't answer, I just sat there, upright still. Not out of control, but because stillness is the only thing you can hold on to when everything else is out of your hands. I've waited before for helicopters that never came. For comrades who didn't answer the radio, for rescue that took hours when we had minutes. But this wait was different. Because you don't get to reload in court, you don't get to improvise. You only get to hope that what you said, what you showed, was enough to crack through whatever bias they carried in with them. Keon eventually broke the silence. You know what I hate most about deliberation? I turned, slightly waiting. It's that it feels like justice is behind some locked vault, he said, eyes on the closed jury door. And we're just sitting here, hoping someone has the right key. The hallway outside buzzed with tension, reporters, activists, onlookers. They had all come, not just for the outcome, but for the aftermath. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about what it meant if I lost, what it meant if I won. I looked down at my hands, steady, open. 20 years ago, these hands had fired weapons, built outposts, saved lives under gunfire. Now they were just resting on a courtroom table, and somehow that felt more vulnerable than anything I'd ever done in uniform. We sat for over an hour, no word. And yet every second dragged like a mile-long convoy under enemy watch. Keon stood, pacing now. He rubbed the back of his neck. They're taking time, he said. That's good, right? I didn't answer, because I knew better. Time doesn't always mean care. Sometimes it means conflict. Sometimes it means someone's trying to unsee what they already know. At one point, the judge returned to chambers. The bailiff brought water. The prosecutor didn't speak, didn't even look at us. He just sat with his arms folded, eyes glued to the floor like it had answers he hadn't found. Finally, footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The jury was coming back. I stood slowly. Keon wiped his palms on his pants, then stood too. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. As they filed back in, I scanned every face. Some were tight-lipped, one looked shaken, another wouldn't meet my gaze at all. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with short gray curls and tired eyes, held a folded slip of paper like it was a loaded weapon. And maybe it was Judge Niles adjusted his glasses. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, yes, Your Honor. She didn't tremble, didn't flinch, but the room did. You could feel it, the collective breath that no one wanted to take until the words were said. Sometimes silence is justice holding its breath. The foreperson unfolded the paper like it might break in her hands. The sound of it, barely a whisper, still echoed across the room like a gunshot. My body didn't move, not my eyes, not my breath. Just stillness. A stillness I'd only ever known in combat right before the bullets start flying. But this time, the danger wasn't coming for my life. It was coming for everything that made it worth living. In the case of State versus Nyla Robert, her voice was steady, too steady. The courtroom leaned forward as one body. We find the defendant. One heartbeat, then two. Not guilty on all charges, I didn't move. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I felt everything at once. Relief, rage, exhaustion so deep it wrapped itself around my bones like fog. I heard a sound to my right. Keon had exhaled loudly, almost like he'd forgotten how to breathe until that moment. He dropped his head for a second, then looked at me, eyes wide, jaw clenched. We didn't hug, didn't high-five, because this wasn't joy, it was release. Like finally standing up after being buried alive. The judge cleared his throat. There is also a jury recommendation. The foreperson continued. We, the jury, strongly recommend that an internal investigation be opened into Officer Bryce Kelton's conduct, both in this case and past incidents brought to light during these proceedings. She paused, then added with no hint of uncertainty. And we urge disciplinary action be taken at the highest level. Now the courtroom wasn't silent, it was stunned. Gasps, murmurs, shifts in every seat. Bryce Kelton didn't look at me. Didn't look at the judge or the jury or even his own lawyer. He just stared down at his badge. That little metal shield bent and gleaming, but no longer a symbol of protection. Just one of exposed power. Judge Niles didn't smile, didn't gloat. But even he couldn't hide the weight of what had just happened. Officer Kelton, he said, voice flat but final, based on the jury's recommendation and the evidence provided, this court advises Crescent City PD to suspend you from duty, effective immediately. Kelton blinked, but he didn't speak. The judge continued, furthermore, the court will refer this matter to the State Attorney General for formal review. If evidence of misconduct or perjury is confirmed, charges will follow. There was a moment, just one, when Kelton looked like he might stand and protest. But he didn't. He slumped back like something inside him had caved. I watched him as he left the courtroom. No handshakes, no solidarity from the officers in the back row. They didn't follow him, didn't nod, didn't move. Just stared as if seeing him for the first time. Keon leaned over whispering, "You won." But I shook my head, not yet. Because justice isn't a verdict, it's what comes after. Outside, the press was already gathering microphones, cameras, voices, yelling for comment. But I walked right past them, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because the truth had already been spoken loud enough for the world to hear. He lost the room, but I reclaimed something bigger. They asked if I'd give a statement. I didn't. They asked if I'd do interviews, stand in front of the courthouse, smile for the cameras. I didn't. Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't about a headline. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about surviving something designed to erase you and walking out, still whole, still burning. So I walked through the crowd, past reporters, past flashing lights, no applause, no speech. Just steps, heavy real. My name floated behind me in whispers. Some said hero, others said troublemaker. I didn't correct either. Let them wonder. Let them try to measure something they never understood. I went home that night and sat in my living room, staring at the folded flag above my mantel. It wasn't just decoration, it was memory, a reminder of who I fought for and what that fight had cost. They thought I came to court to clear my name, but what I came to do was light a fuse, and it worked. 3 weeks later, I received the news in an envelope. Official seal, Crescent City PD, letterhead, 3 lines that changed everything. Officer Bryce Kelton has been terminated from active duty. The internal affairs investigation has been closed. Criminal charges for perjury and obstruction of justice are pending. They called it a personnel decision, said they would reassess training and accountability protocols. But let's not play pretend. This wasn't policy catching up. This was a reckoning, and it was long overdue. What they didn't include in that letter was what came next. A formal apology from the chief of police on live television. He didn't say my name, but I watched his eyes the whole time. The way they flickered on the words, systemic failure. The way he hesitated before admitting that officers like Kelton are not anomalies, but symptoms. It wasn't justice, but it was a crack in the wall. And that crack will spread. Bryce Kelton's mugshot hit the news a week later. No uniform, no badge, just a gray t-shirt and a number across his chest. They tried to soften the headline. Former officer faces legal troubles after controversial case. Troubles, no crimes. Because mistakes don't come with handcuffs. Crimes do I didn't celebrate. Not because I didn't feel something, but because justice isn't loud. It's not confetti and podiums. It's the quiet you earn after screaming for too long. The stillness that comes when the world finally listens, if only for a moment. A few weeks after the trial, a local college asked me to speak at their criminal justice seminar. The professor said my story had become part of the curriculum. He called it a rare example of perseverance in the face of institutional harm. I told him I'd think about it. Because if I spoke, it wouldn't be to inspire, it would be to warn. I haven't returned to my old job, haven't decided what comes next. But I know one thing for certain. This wasn't just one battle. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us who get silenced, dismissed, labeled a threat just for standing still. And so no, I didn't win a war, I just survived the opening shot. But now they know I'm not afraid to fight. Justice isn't loud, but when it speaks, it echoes. He tried to bury me, but I'm not. Earth, I'm fire. Sometimes, silence isn't weakness. It's the storm you didn't see coming. Watching Nyla's story unfold felt like watching the entire justice system hold its breath and finally exhale the truth. This wasn't just about one woman versus one officer. It was about what happens when someone tries to erase you and you refuse to disappear. What hit hardest? It wasn't just the courtroom scenes, it was the discipline, the restraint. The refusal to let trauma turn into rage. Nyla didn't just survive, she strategized her survival and weaponized the truth. And that's the part that stays with me. Because how many black women have sat in silence, cuffed by lies, while the world gave the uniform the benefit of the doubt? How many more still do? This story isn't just a what if, it's a what's real. This story is a dramatized reimagining inspired by real issues. It is created purely for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not target or accuse any individual department or organization. Its goal is to shed light on systemic injustice and elevate the voices often silenced. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, don't let it fade into silence. Leave a comment below. What part hit you hardest? Share this video with someone who still believes silence equals guilt. If you believe the truth, shouldn't have to wear a uniform to be heard. And hit subscribe, because this story might be over, but the fight for justice isn't. Remember, they tried to bury her, but she wasn't earth, she was fire. Thank you for watching this video, wishing you a peaceful day, and see you in the next one.